Is systemic racism real? Ask yourself, is persecuting a criminal for 1 gram of crack and equally persecuting a criminal with 100 grams of cocaine fair? Is persecuting a criminal with 1 gram of crack and equally persecuting a criminal with 18 grams of cocaine fair? Is it fair to demonize one set of users and in some cases imprison them for life without parole, and look at another set of users and consider them victims, refuse to charge them with felonies no matter how many times they break the law, in the attempt to not hinder their upward mobility in society? Fair. When we ask ourselves about systemic racism, we must realize these are things that are not in the past. We must look at facts, we must look at reality, and we must replace all lawmakers who refuse openly to change the systems that are discriminatory against the minority communities and the poor in our country. This is essential. This is American. And these disparities must be stopped.
Drugs are menacing our society. They're threatening our values and undercutting our institutions. They're killing our children. From the beginning of our administration, we've taken strong steps to do something about this horror. Tonight, I can report to you that we've made much progress. 37 federal agencies are working together in a vigorous national effort. And by next year, our spending for drug law enforcement will have more than tripled from its 1981 levels. We have increased seizures of illegal drugs. Shortages of marijuana are now being reported. Last year alone, over 10,000 drug criminals were convicted.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to ask you to bring a major lawsuit against the drug companies on opioids. Some states have done it, but I'd like a lawsuit to be brought against these companies that are really sending opioids at a level that it shouldn't be happening. So highly addictive. People go into a hospital with a broken arm. They come out there a drug addict. They get the arm fixed, but they're now a drug addict. And I'd like us to look at some of the litigation that's already been started with companies. Rather than just joining them, I'd like to bring a federal lawsuit against those companies. I'd also like to have you take a look at the fentanyl that's coming out of China and Mexico, and whatever you can do from a legal standpoint, whether it's litigation, lawsuits, or people and companies. But in China, you have some pretty big companies sending that garbage and killing our people. It's almost a form of warfare.
And the tough new state statutes directed at repeat offenders make it clear that the American people are reasserting certain enduring truths. The belief that right and wrong do matter, that individuals are responsible for their actions, that evil is frequently a conscious choice, and that retribution must be swift and sure.
The terrible measure of the opioid crisis includes the families ripped apart, and for many communities, a generation of lost potential and opportunity. This epidemic is a national health emergency. Do it.
Hi you guys, this is Irene, and the clips you just saw are clips of a former president and our current sitting president regarding drug policy. I'm going to try to make this as quick as possible. I will be throwing up some graphs and things like that just for your consideration. And I am bringing this forward to just discuss something I see presented a lot, which is there evidence for systemic racism? When extreme right people talk, they will often point out that there are no systems or policies in place that are exclusionary in nature, and therefore there is no proof for systemic racism. I liken that argument similar to begging the question. I'm going to coin a new term. It's called begging the answer, because they present a question that can only be answered with no. Most of us have not read all laws, so we could not point out laws that are discriminatory directly to people of color. However, in this short video, I hope to demonstrate that there are in fact policies in place that clearly demonstrate arguably systemic racism within our system. I'm going to use two topics that most people are familiar with because they're easy targets. And I'm going to use the government's own words regarding these policies to prove the point that systemic racism does exist, and that at the end of the day, wherever the facts lead us, we need to go. Sometimes people get so caught up in their rhetoric or the side that they're supposed to be on that they completely ignore fact. And fact is relevant, just period. No matter where it leads us, it is relevant. So I'm going to be looking at criminality with regard to drug use in cells, and I'm going to be looking at immigration policy as two examples, solid examples of systemic racism in our society. I hope this information is useful to you if you're speaking to somebody on these topics, because every time this question is presented, I see that it begs an answer, and the answer does not lead to the right and correct logical conclusion. So with that said, let's get into it. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 initiated treatment that varied between cocaine and crack. What it ended up being was that the act authorized a 100-to-1 scenario. And it worked this way. A single gram of crack was considered equivalent with 100 grams of powdered cocaine. No rationale for the ratio was discussed ever in legislative history. And I think this is important because we will hear arguments that, well, the Congress believed that crack was more dangerous than powder cocaine and this and that. But I have, and I will supply the link, a government document that clearly states no rationale for the ratio was discussed ever in legislative history. It just was not discussed. And so any assumptions are just that, they're assumptions. That said, the Sentencing Commission repeatedly acknowledged the unwarranted disparity. So, right off top, our government is acknowledging that there was a disparity, that there was no rationale that was openly discussed about that disparity, that users and low-level drug dealers were being prosecuted at greater sentences than the people who were seriously pushing the kilos, okay? 1 gram of crack, which means anybody smoking a crack pipe on the street, was punished equally to a person who had 100 grams of powdered cocaine, which is basically a briefcase full of cocaine. In a series of reports, the Sentencing Commission recognized distinct problems with the presumptions in the 1986 Act and attempted to remedy them. In 1995, the Sentencing Commission found that crack powder disparity inconsistent with the 1986 Act's concerns about penalizing serious drug traffickers more severely than street-level dealers. It did exactly the opposite of that, is what they're saying. It found that a disparity resulted in retail crack dealers getting longer sentences than the wholesale drug distributors who supplied them the powder cocaine. Based on these findings, the Sentencing Commission proposed a reduction to the crack powder differential, which will have changed from 100-to-1 to 1-to-1.
The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, United States of America, and that this prison population has gone up for black men because of, in particular, because of disparities in the sentencing laws around crack and cocaine.
Well, this is a very important point. If powder cocaine, 80% of those arrested are white. Crack cocaine, 75% arrested are black. And you need 100 times more powder cocaine to get the same penalty mandatory that you would get with crack cocaine.
Yeah.
There's a disparity. There's no doubt about it.
That's right. And these mandatory sentences, you see our problem. Five-year mandatory sentence for carrying 5 grams of cocaine. So a lot of the increase in the prison population has been because of these mandatory sentences, 3 strikes you're out type of thing, revoking parole because you test positive for drugs. And this is creating really a disaster for the black community. And it has to be we have to put much more into What happens to these young men and women when they come out of jail? There's very little for them.
Congress declined to implement the proposed change. Surprise, surprise, Congress declined to do it. However, it invited the Sentencing Commission to draft a modified ratio for its further consideration. They offered a 5-to-1 ratio up. Congress did not act upon the Sentencing Commission 1997 proposal. Then in 2002, are you following me? This has been going on since 1986, where they were arresting low-level drug dealers and users and charging them more than the people that were really pushing crack or cocaine into those communities. And over again, even though they openly acknowledged that the disparity was unwarranted and there was no record in legislative history at the rationale of doing a 1-to-100 sentencing ratio, they kept doing it. And the Sentencing Commission kept bringing them new proposals to change it, and they didn't change it. So now we're in the 2000s. Now we're in recent history. We're in 2002. And the report goes on to say, additionally, the 2002 report found that 85% of the individuals sentenced under the 100-to-1 ratio were African American, thus resulting in the most severe sentences imposed, primarily on Black offenders. And so they recommended another reduction. So they keep trying to raise the reduction to get the Congress to agree. First they're like 1-to-1. The Congress is like, absolutely no. Then they're like 5-to-1. The Congress is like, absolutely no. Then they're like 20-to-1. The Congress is like, absolutely no. 2007 rolls around. They create a fourth report. I could go on like this, but I think you get my idea. Okay? This was how they approached the war on drugs, where in a government document, I'm reading from a government document, and I will provide the link, the legislative had no rationale for penalizing low-level drug dealers and for penalizing users to the degree that they were penalizing them. And no matter how many times research was done to show that this was disproportionate, that it was affecting the Black community and all these other things, from 1986, and we've gone into 2007 at this point, they refused to act. And this kept going. It kept going. It didn't stop in 2007. I will attach the document so you can read the full history of it yourself. I just want to quell any arguments that we're not clear on what was going on, because the government is very clear on what is going on.
President Obama signed a new law at the White House today that will close the long-disputed gap in federal sentencing for crack versus powder cocaine. Since 1986, defendants caught with 500 grams of powder cocaine have gotten the same punishment, 5 years in prison, as defendants convicted of possessing only 5 grams of crack cocaine. That's a sentencing ratio of 100-to-1. The new law reduces that dramatic disparity, cutting the ratio to about 18-to-1. And for the first time in 40 years, Congress is rolling back a mandatory minimum sentence already on the books.
At the state level, we saw things like life without parole for repeated drug sentencing. So if you were a user, if you were a low-level dealer, if you went into court, you could end up with life without parole, just straight up. And literally, it was just this year that this was even changed. It started to be changed last year, and it just got finalized this year. And so these people are in jail, and they're now able to actually go up for parole. Think about this. Think about it. Absolutely insane, right? With that said, although the bill, so this was done in 1998, but the bills didn't go into effect until 2018, all right, in Michigan. This is at the state level. So you were literally able to go to life go to jail for life without parole for minor drug offenses if you had more than one. I want to take a look back, or a look forward, I should say, and look at how we're dealing with the current opioid epidemic, okay? So we looked at it on the federal level. On the federal level, they clearly knew that they were had a policy that disproportionately attacked the Black population. With that policy, they continued on with it without issue, even though repeatedly, year after year after year, over a decade, it was brought to them and they acknowledged the disparity and they just wouldn't agree to any changes. They just weren't willing to do it at the federal level. They were just comfortable with how it was going. Now we have an opioid addiction that overwhelmingly is only affecting whites. So there are no Black people to pick on in this situation, because just white people are really fond of this drug and Black people not so much.
When a new law takes effect in late July, Maine will join a handful of states where police and prosecutors cannot charge people caught with small amounts of drugs with felonies, ever. Unless there are aggravating factors, possession of anything less than 200 milligrams of heroin, fentanyl, methamphetamine, or pills will be considered a misdemeanor, no matter how many times it happens.
The House accepted the majority report.
Democratic State Representative Mark Dion, who spent 12 years as Cumberland County Sheriff, authored the amendment that essentially rolls back the state penalties.
All we did with this amendment is recognize the true nature of addiction.
Dion says it's not about minimizing accountability, it's about minimizing stigma. Because of the way a felony conviction affects a person's ability to get housing, loans, and work.
I have a problem with turning someone who's 21 years old facing heroin addiction into a felon where when he's 45 we'll wonder why he's been robbed of his ability to have a normal life.
The governor had the opportunity to veto this bill, and he decided not to do that.
As Vermont looks for new ways to combat the problem of opioid addiction, House lawmakers are considering legislation that would soften criminal penalties for possession of heroin and other drugs. Burlington Representative Celine Colburn says drug addiction is first and foremost a public health issue. Harsh criminal penalties, she says, aren't conducive to recovery. Criminal justice system interactions can be very damaging to people in achieving recovery, Colburn says. It makes it harder to get a job. It makes it harder to get employment. These people are very clear. The same people, because you know these people live in their positions. These people are clear on what the effects of the war on drugs in the 80s would have, because when it's their own people, there's a whole different song and dance. So Colburn has introduced legislation that would soften penalties for simple possession of heroin, cocaine, and other drugs by turning felony possession crimes into misdemeanors. Let's listen to Attorney General T.J. Donovan. Do we want to create a class of felons from people who are struggling with addiction, whereby we essentially take away their eligibility to enter into upward mobility in our community? Colburn said earlier, it makes it harder to get a job, it makes it harder to get employment. And then the Attorney General T.J. Donovan, he doubles down on that. Do we want to create a class of felons who are struggling with addiction, whereby we essentially take away their eligibility to enter into upward mobility in our community? He makes it clear that the laws as they stand take away people's ability to enter into upward mobility within the community. And earlier on, representatives spoke very clearly that it makes it harder to get a job and it makes it harder to get employment. Why do you think from the 80s into recent history, those drug laws were kept in place according to the federal document we just read, period, against recommendation, with understanding of the disparity, without attempt to reconcile why it was that they were willing to let that stand with understanding that it was affecting the Black community. Clearly, I have a government document that shows that. It's not arguable. If that's not systemic racism, I don't know what is. I don't know what is. If that's not systemic racism, what is? Let's look at this at the federal level. Trump's stronger, healthier, drug-free society. Our president. Addressing the driving forces of the opioid crisis. President Donald J. Trump's initiative to stop opioid abuse and reduce drug supply and demand will confront the driving forces behind the opioid crisis. He plans to reduce drug demand through education awareness and preventing overprescription. He's starting that lawsuit, as we heard from the clip. Cut off the flow of illicit drugs across our borders and within our communities. We know the FBI is going in and raiding in these predominantly white states. The FBI is playing police officer for them.
Investigation is still going on behind us here in the 7600 block of Eagle Valley Pass. We're in a neighborhood that is just northwest of Crawfordsville Road and 465 on the west side. We can tell you that the FBI, ATF, DEA, Metro Police, and State Police are all working on these raids in this investigation. It's part of a major drug investigation across the entire city.
New at 5, FBI agents bust a meth operation.
KOCO's Morgan Chesky is live with that story. Morgan?
Yeah, Paul, Jess, this bust netted drugs, guns, and also uncovered a serious money laundering operation. Agents say since 2011, agencies from all across the state have been working with officers here at OKC Police Headquarters in trying to bring this ring to justice. Now, today, FBI released some of the details in this case.
Well, good evening. New tonight at 6. Neighbors in West Jordan say they had no idea that a drug trafficking ring may have been operating out of a home in their neighborhood.
Dozens are in jail tonight facing charges in connection with that drug ring. Jeremy Harris has been looking into these arrests. So, Jeremy, lots of agencies were involved in busting this ring, right?
Yeah, that's right, Heidi. And take a look. This is the federal indictment. It's dozens of pages inside a very disturbing story about an international drug cartel peddling not only drugs but also weapons onto Utah streets. Tonight, many of the key players from this story are behind bars.
They want to cut nationwide opioid prescription fills by 1/3 within 3 years. Like, he's playing no games with this. Ensure that 75% of opioid prescriptions reimbursed by federal healthcare programs are issued using best practices within 3 years, 95% within 5 years. Because this is a whole other question. We always talk about Blacks using government funds for welfare and medical and stuff like that. Oh no, I wish I would have kept that map. I might look that map up again. Whites use government services too, and many of them are using government services to get opioids. Yes, it's a real thing. It's called facts, okay? They're doing an online attack for illicit sales of drugs, death penalty for drug traffickers. They're not playing any games. In the 80s, you could barely get to go to jail for trafficking cocaine, but you're going to get the death penalty for trafficking, trafficking opioids. And in bold, help those struggling with addiction. Big thing on their list. These are not criminals. We do not want to, stop them being able to move upward in society. We do not want to label them as felons. We want to soften the penalties. This in contradiction with what went on in the 80s, where all they wanted to do was like raise penalties. All they wanted to do, you know what I mean, is again, they knew that they were targeting Black people, and they literally just dismissed it. Federal document. I have a federal document that says it. There's no argument to this. And I could go on and on and on and on. I'm going to stop here. I'm not going to look at immigration policy. I think it'll be like too much. I might address immigration policy in another video, because there are some other things I could say on that, and I don't want to have 3 videos out just on immigration because I already have one on illegal immigration. So I'm going to stop here. I'm just going to say that words are so important. Like, you guys know that I'm so passionate about words. I'm reading official documents, official stats. I'm showing this information for a reason, because people get into political discussions and start acting dumb. Everything is not all one way or all another way. America has improved in many ways, but denying overt forms of systemic racism is not helpful. Also, blaming the white man for every single thing is a form of white supremacy, but that's a whole nother video that I could make and I plan to make. So with that said, I'm just gonna leave it here. I'm gonna post a bunch of links down below. You know, we compared apples to apples. 2 drug epidemics, how they were handled on the federal level, how they were handled at the local level, at the state level. 2 different approaches. Clear indications of populations that are affected, without question. In one case, black population, in one case, white population. Clear indications that the government understands that these populations are different. Clear indications that in one case, they chose above all reason and all evidence that they were presented with to keep the status quo when they knew it was disproportionately affecting users and low-level dealers and dismissing actual drug trafficking to a whole nother policy that basically encompasses everything in the world. I mean, they're going out to other countries, starting lawsuits. They are attacking the doctors. They are starting nationwide campaigns. Heck, they are developing whole new treatment strategies, okay? They're changing the face of medicine. Like, we need to come up with another way to cure people's pain. You couldn't ask for 2 completely, obviously more blatant differences in approach if you wanted to. And I could go on and on and on about this, because the comparisons between the 2 of these, I'm like looking at the documents in front of me, the comparisons between the 2 of these are shocking. But I'm just gonna post my links, encourage you to do the research, and nobody ever say out of their mouth again, there's no such thing as systemic racism. I will touch on this more in my video on immigration, as well as my thoughts on what Trump said back in January, and if I believe in selective, or what some people like to call elitist, immigration strategy. But I will do that in another video, and I will touch on how immigration also proves a system of systemic racism as well. And I'm sure, like I said, I could come up with many, many other examples, because it just doesn't stop here. So, yes, there is systemic racism. We need to be more educated. The problem with being fake pro-black, the problem with just running your mouth about the white man this, the white man that, is that that is not a good argument, okay? It's just as bad of an argument as the, what law can you point to that's excluding you? You know, like, they're both bad arguments. And I feel like a lot of the people that present these kind of arguments, they're dishonest people. They're not genuine people. They're not about anything. You know what I mean? It's just something to get you guys riled up and emotional. There are real issues we can tackle systemically within our system. And then there are some things that you just need to stop blaming white people on. I mean, white people for. So, you know, we have to know the difference. And we have to know how to pick these battles and fight these battles and approach these battles with facts and demonstrate them. Okay? And not just get into debates and arguments with people who have a well laid out rhetoric. And also not be baited by begging the answer. Yes, I'm coining that term, because we do that so much. Language can be limiting and questions can be focused. We watch this in conditioning within the public school system all the time. So this should not be a surprise to anybody. But I do want to say that this is a very clear indication. And again, I could touch on this more. I could come up with comparisons like this all day, every day for systemic racism. Like, don't even put up the challenge for me, because I could. And come with receipts. That said, you guys, I'm out of here. I hope you found this useful and informative. I hope whatever side of the aisle that you identify with, you know, at the end of the day, we have to remember that the average person is not passing these laws, but the average person is assimilating the conditioning and the programming that comes through to build public support for these laws. We can't stick our heads in the sand. We have to be realistic and open about where things are at and where things are not at on all fronts, and pander to the reality and the facts more than anything. With that said, I'll talk to you guys later.
Take one question from here, then take one on the other end.
I think we have a right side of the room bias.
Take one.
Hi, Professor. Yeah, thanks for your talk. I'd like to find out from you, what's your view of institutional racism? Is it a thing, or is it some other radical leftist agenda?
I didn't quite catch the first part.
What's your view of institutional racism, or systematic racism, as some people may call it?
System.
Yes. Is it a thing? Is it an actual thing, or is it some other agenda that you might attribute to radical leftists?
It's a multivariate problem, right? Like, no society is without its biases and prejudices, and some of them get built into the systems themselves. And so when you look at unequal outcomes and you're trying to discover why those unequal outcomes exist, if you have any sense, then you do a multivariate analysis and you put in prejudice and discrimination as one of the factors. One of the factors. One of many, many factors. And what the problem with the radical leftists is that they take the fact that societal structures are tyrannical to some degree and arbitrary, which of course they are because they're imperfect, and then they obliterate the rest of the complexity with that claim. So there's lots of reasons for inequality. Systemic bias is one of them. It's an open question to what degree systemic bias plays in the inequality problem, let's say. But it's something that we could hypothetically address with a certain degree of detachment and intelligence. So no system is perfect. Not, and certainly not ours. Reasonable answer? Okay. That's wise.